Well, I'm pretty glad I'm sitting in between these two gentlemen here. I don't want to come to physical. But so we started at 9:30, I think. It's been almost an hour, and we haven't heard anything from you. So I'm just giving you a heads up. I'm going to start cold calling you if you don't have questions for these two gentlemen on my left. I'm going to kick this off by asking one question, and then it's going to be up to you to take it forward. So my question for both of you is very simple. Does the divisions in the United Kingdom about Europe, the European Union, does the debates over that give countries like Belgium an advantage in terms of being able to establish relationships with emerging markets like India?
Well, not yet, because I don't think most of our foreign partners believe the British are remotely going to contemplate leaving the European Union, and still more, leaving the single market. But we've got to make sure that we don't start worrying people about that prospect. Inward investors do ask to be reassured. I certainly find that. I've had Japanese, I've had Americans, I can't remember an Indian actually, saying to me they didn't think they'd be investing here if they thought the British were remotely likely to leave the European Union. And I don't think the British will leave the European Union, but I think it's quite important that the business community help the political class to make sure of it. On the other hand, to put a more positive aspect on it, particularly as I'm aware that John Redwood is sitting in my audience, as I caught sight of him earlier on, and there's a slight nuance of difference of opinion between John and myself, I think you will acknowledge on this subject. We always say we agree on economic policy, which we do. Trade and investment, you'll find the two of us are absolutely in the same place, but the European context perhaps complicates matters. But on the other hand, if we get reform underway, if this strange event stimulates some genuine reform and accelerates the economic development of the European market, that will be good for all of us. Most importantly, it will be very good for Europeans, because we'll stop becoming a slightly declining part of the global economy if we can indeed complete the single market, if we can indeed get some proper trade agreements with our major trading partners, if we can liberalise our own economies, if we can deregulate in Brussels as we're trying to deregulate in London, and Barroso's been trying in Brussels, and we're trying in London, and we have a huge deregulation bill in which I'm about to take part with Oliver in presenting in the House of Commons to try to give some reality to this in Britain. That in the end will be a good thing. But so far it's quite important, I think, to reassure people looking towards this country that the likely outcome of any campaigning and any referendum, if one is held in the next few years in this country, is that we will stay firmly as leading members of the European Union, which gives Britain a significant role in the modern world. And if we succeed in doing that with the help of the business community, probably it will have a stimulating effect beyond the referendum on Britain's attractiveness as a base, because we do have the most flexible labour markets. We compete with the Belgians in being a liberal, open to the outside world. That's one reason why the Belgians are usually our allies on all the reforms I've talked about, because we do have lots, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Germans, Scandinavians, Spanish. The Latins are not all reactionary. Are perfectly pro-British attempts to get reform, modernisation of the European Union structure. And as a very pro-European Union person myself, I do readily concede that it does need reform. It has not yet delivered what it could have delivered if it developed in the right way in the last 50 years.
Thank you, Mr. Clarke. Mr. Ambassador?
Well, it's not really for me to comment on what is a typically UK discussion right now, except to say that I can openly tell you that I'm quite confident that the UK will stay in the European Union, and that indeed this debate is contributing to strengthening certain weaker aspects of the European construction. You were just talking about deregulation. I think many of us would accept that indeed something can be done in terms of red tape and that kind of things. And there are other suggestions being made by the UK, including in the speech of January of the Prime Minister, that we can certainly learn about. And we should just take that up together with our friends here in London and not look at that as a kind of antagonistic play where the UK has a very specific position. Just to tell you, of course, that the last country to leave the European Union will be Belgium, because we are the seat of the institutions themselves, and it would be rather an odd proposition that we leave the Union and leave those institutions in Brussels. But let me just add one thing to that. That is the fact, of course, that we have the headquarters of NATO and of the European Union is an asset for Belgium in terms of having foreign investors come to our country, because that brings them much closer to the decision-making center of those things. You may know that Brussels today is the capital with the highest number of foreign diplomats, which is symptomatic of the kind of intrinsic decision-making machinery that is going on there. So highest numbers of foreign diplomats, highest numbers today of foreign correspondents, of journalists, and indeed of lobbyists. And that makes it a pool of attraction of a lot of foreigners in general and foreign investments in particular, in addition to the classical assets that I mentioned, among which I forgot to tell you something about the port system. That is that Antwerp, as you know, is the second largest port in Europe, but the cluster of ports, Antwerp, Zeebrugge, and Ostend, is the 5th largest in the world, which is not nothing, just to give you again that idea of the centrality of Belgium and Brussels with the port system, with the airport systems, with the train connections, all going all over Europe. And I hasten to add that the fact that you are here in London is in fact also a contribution to that hub. You are a hub, well, London is a hub towards Europe, but we know that many of you first come to Brussels and then go on towards Germany, Italy, and what have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? I see a hand over there. Could you just say who you are and to whom the question is addressed?
Hi, my name is Vasu Majumdar. I'm from the Grant Thornton Financial Advisory Firm. I work on a lot of cross-border transactions from M&A perspective between UK and India and sort of UK and Europe as well. In my experience, I guess, interesting point, His Excellency Mr. Verbeke mentioned about the language aspect. I guess there are two kinds of language which exist. One is business, which is English, I think, across the world. But I think the nuances exist in the languages, especially in Mandarin or, as a matter of fact, in Indian transactions, where your social aspect is around speaking Hindi or Mandarin. Now, the question I'm going to ask to both the gentlemen there is, first off to the UK government, in terms of the schools and colleges, are you doing anything to sort of introduce those two languages in schools so that the next generation can actually understand and appreciate the nuances regards to culture? I think that's the heart of the matter in terms of having two parallel languages. One is a business language and the other one is the kind of understanding the intricacies of knowing individuals, basically.
Mr. Bastra, I'm going to give Mr. Clarke the last word.
Yeah, I think, as I told you, languages is important, not just as a technical means of communication. It's also important in order to understand the spirit of the people you're talking about. That is why we Belgians, in general, wherever we are, we try to speak the language of the country where we are. And we don't have really too much problems with that. Again, I'm coming back to the fact that we are sitting on that line between the Germanic and the Latin cultures, which means that we, all of us, my father was French-speaking, my mother was a Dutch-speaking person. One of my children now lives in the Francophone party, other one in the Flemish party. We have that kind of culture about learning languages. And therefore, whenever you drop me, for instance, as a diplomat in the Arab world, which happened, I lived in both Lebanon and Jordan, I learned Arabic. I was later on in Santiago de Chile, I spoke Spanish. And that's the kind of mentality we have. Now, I understand that your question was also bearing upon the schooling system within our countries, and I understand that that is more important for the UK because the Indian community here in the UK is much more important than it is in Belgium. I'm not aware whether courses are being offered in your languages in our school system, but there are, and this I know for sure, there are community schools, for instance in Antwerp, where in the evening and on Saturdays languages can be learned. But I am not sure whether on that point I got your question right.
Was that your question?
Was it indeed that you were asking for schools?
I guess my point was, these are the two fastest growing economies. 10 years from now, they will be the economies to sort of where businesses are targeting. So it's very important for especially European countries and English-speaking countries to understand the languages of those fast-growing economies. So my question is to really, at the grassroots level, what are the governments doing and what people like yourself who are in a seat of power at the moment doing to address that issue,
okay.
which is something going to happen in the future?
Yeah, got it.
Yeah, well, no, I share your proposition. And it's not just because you have now become important. For instance, the courses in Chinese in Belgium have increased exponentially. So, and the same is true for you.
Thank you. Clarke?
Yeah, well, firstly, the drift of the question I entirely agree with. And I'm a classic product of a good British education, so I have poor French. And I can manage conversational Spanish if, for a bit. That's about it. That's self-taught. But at least in my day, everybody did do French up to a certain level. And we have had a catastrophic decline in the teaching of languages in recent years, which I think is being slowly reversed. I mean, all the present educational reforms, the thrust of educational reforms, I'm not making it particularly party political, I think they've accelerated the thrust, but for the last 10 years has been to slightly get back to a more serious curriculum, concentrating on sensible subjects and trying to restore the teaching of languages in this country, to get it back a bit towards where it used to be, and actually start introducing a wider range of languages that people are taught, which is exactly the question that you ask. And the whole thrust of what's being done at the moment is plainly going in that direction. It's a combination of people realizing it had become a little idiotic, that I think the majority of state secondary schools no longer taught a modern language, and in the modern world that was idiotic. And the idea that we've had a recession so that parents and pupils and teachers are getting more conscious of the fact that you need to learn things that are going to be of some use in earning your living in the modern world is leading to a steady restoration in the teaching of modern languages. I trust it will continue. It was a decision, I can't remember who made it, but it was a few years ago when schools were allowed in the course of the national curriculum to opt out of modern languages about halfway through the second stage if they wanted, and a vast majority did, because it's difficult. You might not get the right results that get you in the right place in the league tables. There are easier things to do, led to almost the collapse of modern language teaching, and it's a long way back. On the more positive side, we do, for example, have specialist schools, language schools, and in my constituency, I think probably about 7 or 8 comprehensives, perhaps not quite that many. One of them is a specialist language school. Every time I go there, they take me into the classroom where they're all learning Mandarin. I don't think they're learning an Indian language there, but they're trying to get, there are quite a lot of multilingual pupils coming through the school, by no means unique. Mandarin is now taught quite widely in our schools. Modern technology enables modern methods of language teaching to be promulgated, which helps a lot. But having said that, we're doing our best, but I agree with you, we have a long way to go. We're encouraged to be idle. The Belgians, you just take for granted in Belgium that everybody speaks English, and half of them speak another foreign language. That's the advantage of being, in population terms at least, I'm not denying what you've just said, Ambassador, but in population terms, quite a small country in the middle of a multilingual part of the world. We're spoilt because English is the first language now of business and politics. And when I go to European councils of ministers, in the old days, the Frenchman would never speak a word of English to me, except socially afterwards, when he turned out to speak fluently. But we all insisted on using these interpreters. Nowadays, the best business I ever did in the Justice Council, the real business, was always over the lunch, when just the ministers were on their own. All the women in the we had fantastic simultaneous interpreters, all of whom could have their lunch if they wanted, because they weren't needed. Once the 28 ministers got together to have a proper conversation privately together around a table, everybody spoke fluent English, probably because they were all lawyers, most of them, but I mean, they all spoke fluent English. Now, the English should not believe from that we don't need to do something about our deplorable levels of attainment in languages generally, and we won't get into markets like the Asian markets without getting used to having to learn a very much wider range of languages.
And on that literary note, we must stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.